Welcome to part 2 of making a simple platformer in Unity. In this video, I'm going to pick up where we left off in the last one, and I'm going to get to work on adding some enemy AI. So the first thing we're going to do is we're just going to make some changes to our character controller real quick. And in here, what we want to do is we want to add the ability to have a ground check for the character. If we're using it for our AI, for example, my idea is that as our little snail character moves to the left or right, we'll put the ground check just in front of them. So if they're going to fall off the platform, they turn around and move the other way. Okay, so we're going to need a couple of variables here for the ground check situation. So let's serialize a field. Serialize field. Here we're going to do private transform ground check or transform. So this is going to be from where, on which character do we want to do the ground check. So we'll just create an empty game object on each of our characters that need to use this, and then we'll drag it into this field. Then we want a serialize field. We want a private float ground check radius. This is going to be, we're going to be using something called a circle overlap to check if we're colliding with any of the ground objects. And then we want a private layer mask underscore ground check layer. Ooh, can't spell. And this will be, we're going to use this in our circle cast to check if we're colliding with any ground objects or objects that are on the ground layer. Okay, so then the next thing we're going to do is let's add a private function here, private void do ground check. Okay, and we're also just going to need a property here. So we'll do public bool is grounded, and this will be a get and private set, so that we can only set the value from within this class, but we can get it from any class outside of this. So maybe in future we want to check from somewhere else. If the player is grounded, then we can do some logic there. Okay, here what we're going to do is we're going to say collider to D, collider equals physics 2D dot overlap circle. And then in here, what we're going to use is our ground check transform dot position. So we want to do this check from the position of our transform. And then in here, we want to add the ground check radius. And then we only want to do this ground check on the ground layers. So we'll add in our ground check layer. And then all we need to do here is say if the collider not equals null. So if we have actually collided with something, then we set is grounded to true. Otherwise, we set is grounded to false. Cool. And then now, at the end of our fixed update loop, we can just do ground check. And then each physics frame, after the character's done all of its physics movements, it will check if the character is on the ground. And if so, then it will set the value of the is grounded property to true or false accordingly. And that's perfect. So let's do a quick test to see if this is working. And in our fixed update even, we can just do a debug.log, debug.log, and we can say is grounded. And now we can go back to Unity and we can hit play. And then in our little console, we're going to get lots of errors because none of our values that we added to our character controller have been assigned yet. So to our character, okay, we've got our character controller script over here. And as we can see, we've got some ground check stuff going on. Maybe to make this a bit easier to read, let's go back here quick, and above this ground check stuff, let's add a header called ground check. Okay, so this will just help us separate the properties in our inspector, and here we can just add a header for movement. And now when we go back to Unity, then we can see we have this nice little separation so that it's easier to tell what's going on in our component. So now on our character, let's add a empty game object, and we will call this ground check position so that we know what this game object is for in future. And we can just, okay, I just hit W there to go to the move tool. And then we can just move this down because we want to do the ground check from the player's feet. And then if we go back to our character controller, then we can just drag in our ground check transform. And in here for our layer, we want to be looking for our ground layer. Cool. And now, if we hit the play button, then we can see we get lots of falses, which is not correct, should not be correct because our player is grounded. So let's go check if our layer on our grid component is correct, because remember we're using the tile palette. So as we can see, we've currently got the tile palette set to the default layer, which is why that wasn't returning as true. So if we just update this and set it to the ground layer, it asked me if I wanted to change the layer of the children as well. So I just said yes. So all of our tiles will be on the ground layer now. And there we go. We can see that our value is true when we're grounded. And if we jump, then the value is false. Okay. So that's cool. Now, how do we actually use this for our AI character? So let's just delete our debug.log because we don't want that to be spitting out a bunch of nonsense. And the next thing we're going to do is we're going to need an AI script. So I'm just going to go in here and create a folder. We'll call it AI. And inside of it, we're going to call this AI script the snail AI. Okay. And now in our snail AI, what we want to do is, firstly, we want a reference to our character controller. So let's do character controller underscore controller. In our awake function, we just want to say controller equals get component character, whoopsie daisy, character controller. There we go. And this should actually be pretty simple. So what we're going to do is we're going to make a private vector to start direction. And this one we can actually serialize. So let's serialize this so that we can change it in our inspector if we want to specify a direction for a starting direction for our snail anyway. So we'll just set this to vector2.right by default. So we'll always expect our snail to move to the right. Actually, let's make it left because I think our snail character is left facing. If we go look real quick, yeah, our snail character is facing the left. So let's just make the default value that he will move to the left by on start. And then we can also add a private vector2, and we'll call this current direction. Okay. And then on awake, we'll just set the current direction equals the start direction. Cool. And then in our update loop, what we can do is we can just say on our character controller, let's call the move function and we'll call it in the current direction. And cool. That's all we really need to do because now we'll be setting the value of our snail, of our snail's character controller to move to the current direction on start. So let's just test that that works before we handle any changing direction logic or anything like that. So what we're going to need to do is to our snail prefab, let's actually open the prefab so that this affects all of the snails in the scene. So let's open this asset in isolation. And then we can enable our character controller now. And then let's add the ground check transform for now, even though we're not going to use it just yet. We're going to in a moment. Ground check transform. So then we can just drag this in here and let's also reposition it. Oopsie. So we want, sorry, did I drag in the right thing? I did. Okay. And then let's drag in the ground check transform to like the front of the snail, because this is where we want to do our ground check. It's at the front bottom of the snail, and we want to see, okay, if this now becomes off of ground, then we want to do some logic. So We'll just put that in there. And the last thing we need to do to this is we need to add our snail AI component, right? And our start direction is currently set to -1, 0, which is perfect. And now let's press play and see what happens. Woo! Okay, so our snails move. They move really fast though, which is very unlike a snail, but at least they move. So what we can do is in our character controller, let's come here and let's reduce the speed way down to like 1. And let's see what that looks like. There we go, that's much better. So now our snails move, and as we can see, they push the player along. So, okay, so now how do we use our ground check situation to move our snail, or to get our snail to change direction once they're about to fall off the platform? So what we can do there is let's head back to our code. And in our snail AI, here we can just say, okay, so how we can do this is we can say, if the if the character is not grounded, so not is grounded, we need to call our controller here, controller.isGrounded. Oops, that's a property. All right, so if our player is not grounded, and if our current direction equals the vector2 dot left, then we want our current direction to equal vector2 dot right, and I think that would have added some other unnecessary things. Let's just delete that. Else our current direction should be left. Oops. Cool. So now if we run this again in Unity, let's see what happens. Whoa, okay, so our guy is getting super confused. It seems like he keeps changing direction. So what have we done wrong here? Let's take a look. Okay, so the problem here is that even though we're setting our character to start moving to the right, the ground check is still going to fail, and the character is still going to think it's off the ground because its transform is still looking in this direction. So it's going to keep flipping. So what we can do here is we can flip the scale of our character, right? So like if you look at this snail and then we take this X value and we make it -1, then it flips it over. So now the whole character is looking in the opposite direction. So let's do that in code. And in here we can just say, okay, so if it's moving to the right, then the transform of our snail dot local scale equals new vector3, and we'll flip the scale to be -1f when it's moving right, and it can stay 1f on the y and z axes, and then we can do the opposite on if we're moving left. Cool. So let's see if that fixes our problems. Whoa, we still have problems. Okay, so what is going on here? Let's see. You know what I think we didn't do? Prefab, open asset in isolation, character controller. We didn't set our ground layer on our character's ground check. So in here, we need to make sure that our ground check layer is set to ground. And there we go. Woo, our little snails are moving and they change direction as they reach the end of the platform. Cool. So that is simple snail AI, man. I hope you guys have found it useful, and let me know if you want to keep making more videos on this. Just keep an eye out on a playlist. I'll make a playlist called like Simple Platform or something so that you guys can keep track of all of the videos. And yeah, I hope you found this useful. Again, you can find the source code for this part on my Patreon channel. Thanks again to my Patreons. You guys are the best, and I'll catch you on the next one.